In this video series, we're going to begin to explore the idea of lists. Sometimes lists are called arrays. So if you have friends who are taking a different programming course, they might be talking about arrays, and in our Python world, we'll call those lists. By the end of this series, you'll be able to understand the benefits of using the list data structure, know the syntax for declaring lists in Python, become familiar with some common functions that Python provides to make working with lists easy and convenient. These include print, len, and sort. As we begin, let's think about why we might find lists useful in a program. Well, people often use lists to store information, and you frequently use software that includes lists. For example, Canvas stores a list of all the assignments that you need to submit for the semester. Banner stores a list of all the courses you've taken at UMW. iTunes stores a list of all the music that you've purchased. Your phone stores a list of all the phone numbers in your contacts, and the UMW network stores a list of all the valid usernames and passwords for the campus network. So through software, you probably interact with several lists of data every day. Let's think about what a list is. So a list is a linear collection of like-typed items. There's a lot in that single small sentence. Let's think about what each piece means. Linear means that each item has something that comes just before it and something that comes just after it. And so linear just means you could line up all of the items. In fact, when we create lists as a human being on a piece of paper or a sticky note, often we arrange items linearly so that we have a list that we look through from top to bottom or from left to right. And that's no different with the computer. The computer arranges items that are stored in a list in a linear fashion. Lists are collections of like-typed items, which just mean that the data values in the list typically all represent the same kind of thing. Your iTunes playlist contains songs, your grocery list contains things you should buy at the grocery store, and you wouldn't store song titles in your grocery list because they're not the right kind of information. Here, type refers to the meaning of the information, not the data type like integers or floating point values. Now, an interesting thing about lists in Python are that lists don't have to have all the same data type. So it does make sense for lists in general to contain items that represent the same sort of information, that all represent grocery items or all represent songs. However, Python doesn't actually require you to have the same data type in every element of a list. So your list might store a combination of numeric values, text data, decimal data. Everything can be all sort of mixed together. But most functional lists store the same kind of information in all of the elements. Now, you might be thinking about lists as a data type because it's sort of similar to string information, integer information, and floating point information. But lists are actually an organizational structure, and we call that a data structure in computer science. A data structure is just a tool for organizing data. So it helps programmers impose some structure on a group of data values. And a list does just that. It's not a single data point, it's a collection of information. Let's look at the syntax for creating a new list variable in Python. So the general syntax looks like this. You pick an identifier that you want to associate with your list, and then you use the assignment operator to assign values. And then if you want to create a new empty list, you use empty square brackets. And the square brackets are on the upper right-hand corner of your keyboard, kind of around the character P. So if you put an open square bracket and a closing square bracket right next to each other, it makes a brand new empty list. You can also create a list that already has some data stored inside it. And if you wanted to do that, the initialization would look something like this. Pick the name for your list variable, the identifier, and then use the assignment operator. And then inside the square brackets, you would list all the different data values that you wanted to include in your list. Let's do some examples. I'm going to open a Python window. And we're just going to be trying some things out. I'm just going to use the interpreter window right now. So if I want to make a new empty list, call it my list. I just type those open and closing square brackets right next to each other. That's going to make a new empty list. And we're going to learn about the print command to print them out, but that's a way to test it to see if it indeed made our list. And you can see that it knows that it's a list, it put the square brackets there, and it knows that it's empty. Let's say that I wanted to make a list of my favorite songs. I'm going to call it song list, and I'm going to store the songs, everybody's favorites. Mary Had a Little Lamb, and the alphabet song, and Twinkle Twinkle. And notice that in this example, each of my data values was a string, and so I had to include double quotes around each item. So Mary had a little lamb, and then closing the double quotes for that data element, and then I have a comma to separate the next data element. And then the next string literal alphabet song, closing double quotes for that one, then the comma, then the last set of double quotes for my last item, Twinkle Twinkle, and then finally the closing square bracket to indicate the end of the list. And again, I can print that out to verify that those data values are stored inside the list. It's sort of interesting, whenever Python prints out the list, it automatically changes the double quotes to single quotes as it's displaying things. And that's true, I think, unless my data values have an apostrophe in it. Let's test out my theory. If the list equals So I stored John's name and Sophie's name. So those are character strings that have a single quote in them. And when I print them out, it does keep them as double quotes around each of the individual strings because the string elements include a single quote. If all of my data elements do not include a single quote, then it changes my double quotes to single quotes as it displays them. And that's totally normal for Python, not something that you need to worry about if that ever happens in your program. It won't cause any trouble. Let's take a minute and draw out what this would look like if we stored this list with our song names in it in the computer's memory. So I think of the list as a sequence of memory boxes. Remember when we imagined that the computer's memory looked like ice cube trays? So as we're thinking about a list, it's kind of like each of the individual list items is in a ice cube tray box right next to each other. So the first box stores my first element, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and my second box stores the second element, the alphabet song, and my third box stores Twinkle Twinkle. And those are just right next to each other in the computer's memory. Remember that the computer likes to associate numbers with its various memory cells, and that's true in lists as well. It always associates the number 0 with the first item in the list, the number 1 with the second item in the list, and then finally the number 2 with the third item in the list. Let's suppose you wanted to create a list of your 3 favorite numbers. Let's do that and see how that's different than creating a list of text values. So my number list stores a 3, and then 2021, and then 3838, and then 7. And notice that when I'm creating my list of numeric values, I don't need to include double quotes around the individual values. That's because they're numeric in nature rather than text information. And I can print that out as well. And you'll see that it doesn't include any quotes around everything. It knows that those are numeric values, and it has them all associated together in its memory with the identifier number list. Think about how you would draw that array. If you're thinking it'll look pretty much the same, it's kind of like individual squares in our ice cube tray next to each other, and the one at address 0 will store the first value, 3. The one at address 1 will store the next value, 2121. The one at address 2 will store the third value, 3838. And then finally, the last one, the one at address 3, will store the value 7. Now, as I've been creating my examples, I've been using the word list as part of the identifier, and I do that a lot just to help me remember that this is a variable that represents a collection of items. It's not just a single value, but that's not something that Python requires. Python's completely happy no matter what identifier you select for your list, as long as it follows the Python rules for identifiers in general. Now, because lists are so common and they're used in so many programs, Python includes a lot of tools that make working with lists really easy. and we're going to be learning about those in the next video segment.